You're listening to The Portfolio Composer, hosted by me, Dr. Garrett Hope, where business and creativity go hand in hand. Join us at theportfoliocomposer.com for news, talks, and workshops. This episode is brought to you by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Dorico Pro 3 is a major new version with game-changing advances in note input, notation, and engraving. Also available from Steinberg is Dorico Elements, an entry-level application that packs all of the essential power of Dorico Pro into a simple, streamlined package that is ideal for those getting started. Find out more later in the show. Hello, you are listening to The Portfolio Composer. I'm your host, your coach, your teacher, Garrett Hope, and I'm very excited for today's episode because it's a long conversation with a friend, a longtime listener of the podcast, actually, who is now out there creating resources to help other composers just like you be able to write better music in a more meaningful and unified way. Today's discussion is with Dr. Joseph Sowa, who draws his diverse influences to create music of detailed textures and vivid colors. His works have been played and commissioned by groups like Prism Quartet, Hub New Music, and the Genesis Chamber Singers, and in sacred and educational settings. He is on the executive board of the Music Creators Academy, which teaches creative music making to middle and high schoolers across North America. He coaches composers to achieve their artistic and financial goals by helping them own their voice. Enjoy. Joseph, this is the Portfolio Composer podcast. Joseph and I connected 4 years ago, almost 5, something?
Yeah, something like that.
Joseph found the podcast, and he was very responsive to my mailing list. He was one of the testers on the course that I created a long time ago, and I got to meet him in person at a new music gathering, and we've just developed a wonderful friendship. Joseph is a great collaborator and musical thinker, and it's been fun to walk this road of building a composition business with him. So, Joseph, I'm so glad to bring you on the podcast to talk about the stuff you're working on now. So welcome.
Thank you, Garrett. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah. So you've listened to the show enough. You know what question is coming. And it's the idea that is the name of the podcast, the idea that we build a portfolio of income-producing activities, because the idea of a job is pretty much dead, especially in the creative career. So we do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but we can do it with intention and planning. Joseph, what is in your portfolio?
Yeah, so there are several things that are in my portfolio. Obviously, one of the main things that I do is I'm a composer. I'm currently working on my first piece for concert band. I'm really excited about that. It's coming along really well. I have several other chamber pieces that are lined up in the works. In addition to my composing, I also work as a teacher and as a coach. I'm currently teaching Intro to Film Music at Northeastern, and that's been fun. And lately, I've started coaching composers. I coach composers to achieve their artistic and financial goals by helping them own their voice, which is what we're going to talk about today.
That's really interesting. Why don't we just dive right in? Because what does that mean to own your voice?
Yeah, the whole question of voice can be sometimes a fraught thing for composers. Oftentimes, when composers talk about voice, you get this sense that you're talking about style or the unique technical things in a composer's music that make them stand out. And I really think that that view is wrong, or at the best, it's very misguided. When I think about voice, I think that it consists, in addition to style, of 3 other dimensions. It consists of your stories, your process, and your relationships. And these 4 things interact like the 4 parts of a chorale. And it's at the intersection of these 4 dimensions, your stories, process, technique, and relationships. When these things are in harmony, it's the harmony of these things that's your voice. When one of these parts is out of harmony or missing, it creates a confusing sound that turns people off what you have to share. But when they're all in harmony, then people can clearly hear what it is that you have to offer, and you become empowered to most fully create the artistic life and impact that you envision.
I'm wondering what caused you to start thinking about this framework, and why did you create it?
Yeah, well, it should come as no surprise to anyone that when I was an undergraduate, I was just as insecure and uncertain about what to do with my music as we pretty much all are.
You too?
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of conversations that I've had with composers, and I'm sure that your listeners have too, of just us bonding over our insecurities. And then that was really the starting point. It was this frustration that I felt within myself of I have music that I want to create, but I'm not capable of doing it. And the people that I am sharing it with aren't necessarily seeing or hearing in my music what I'm seeing or hearing in it. And so it took me like the better part of a decade to really dig into and find out, okay, how is it that I can share my music with other people in a way that it's meaningful to them? And it was in the process of years of reading, conversations, talking with people that I finally put together this framework of, okay, it's me being a good composer is more than just my technique. And it's even more than just do I get my work done on time. But the core of me being a good composer also has to do with my stories and my relationships.
Elaborate on that. Let's start with the relationship since you brought that up.
Yeah. So when I think about relationships, so like I mentioned, I think of these four things like a chorale. Relationships would be like the base part of the chorale. They form the foundation for the harmony and the foundation of everything that's happening in it. And in life, it's exactly the same way. I mean, unless you're the kind of composer who doesn't let anybody know about what they're doing, which if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure you're not, then your music exists within this network of relationships. You have your mentors, you have your colleagues, you have institutions, you have your partners and families and friends, the people that are all invested and are all a part in your musical journey in different ways. And that's the context that you're putting your music into. I think oftentimes we can trick ourselves into thinking that we're in this context of somehow we're competing within like a history book or within like a New Yorker article, when it's like, no, the relationships that we actually have with people in a direct way matter a lot more than the relationships that we imagine in our minds.
Can we define what kind of relationships you're talking about? Or do you mean all relationships?
Sure, I mean all relationships, but I think that some spheres matter more than others.
Like what?
So for instance, probably the sphere that like is sitting behind a lot of our motivation is the relationships that we have that define our inspirations and aspirations. So for instance, some of these relationships can be with people that we haven't personally met. Like John Williams doesn't know this, but I have a great relationship with John Williams in the sense that he, was a major inspiration for me growing up, and I still really admire him now to this day. I hope to meet him at some point, but that hasn't happened yet. But there are other mentors that I have that fall into that category of people that have inspired me and helped move me along my path. That's one sphere. Another sphere of relationships that's really meaningful is looking at who it is that you're collaborating with to create your music. So this could include individual musicians, ensembles, artistic directors, administrators, anybody that helps bring your music to life. These are like really where the rubber hits the road of the relationships that are part of you making your music. Another major sphere of what your relationships look like that overlaps a fair amount with the sphere of creation collaboration are the people that you're trying to influence and serve. So some of this would be audience members of, the people that are listening to your music. What feeling do you want them to have? How do you want to change their lives? But a lot of your audience members as well are your collaborators, or at least are potential collaborators. And so there's some overlap between I'm working directly with you and bringing musical projects to life, and with you are experiencing this musical thing that I have made, and it is influencing you or serving you in some way.
What about other composers or another performer on our instrument? Someone who, on the surface, appears to be a competitor.
Well, maybe I would ask you a little bit more of what you think about that, Garrett, of why are we thinking about this person as a competitor?
Well, that's the question, right? I think a lot of people fall into this mindset that the pie is of a fixed size. There's only so many opportunities. And I see this person getting all of these things. They're getting the commissions, they're getting the performances, whatever metric we're using. And in a traditional market analysis, that leads us to think, okay, these are my market competitors that we're all trying to compete for the same audience. I don't have that view, and I don't think you do either. But how does that relationship, which can be complex, I mean, another composer can be a peer that, as iron sharpens iron, makes you a better composer and a better person, or it can be someone that you have a negative view towards, biased primarily by the attitude that you're in direct competition with them. So how does that relationship play into the framework?
Well, it's like anything else in life. If you have negative views about someone, that's definitely going to make your relationship with them more complicated. But I would really tend to agree with you, Garrett, and I'd agree with you really strongly that the pie is not a fixed size. And that if we go into composing with a scarcity mindset, not only is that making it more difficult for us, but it's just not accurate.
Yeah, that's so true. How have you seen this in the coaching you've done and the composers you've worked with? The scarcity mindset, how does that play out?
Well, one of the ways that it's played out is, again, talking about people trying to get commissions and performances, right? If I had to choose a single biggest desire that I have as a composer or that other composers have, it'd be like, I want my music performed more often. I want more commissions, right? And one of the ways that I've seen this scarcity mindset play out is in this idea that if I'm good enough, people will commission me. Or if I'm good enough, then people will perform my music. And I think a lot of where that meritocracy kind of thinking comes from, it comes from a couple places. First off, even music aside, that's the way that we learn how to think through our public schooling and here in America, is that you're in a competition, and if you're good enough, you'll get an A, and, everyone just falls down the academic pecking order. And if you're getting your training as a classical musician, it tends to be that way as well. We put these composers and these performers on these lofty pedestals and make it seem as if, the standards for success is being as good of a composer as Beethoven is, which, when you stop and think about it, is ridiculous. It's obscene on a lot of different levels. And we'll probably get to that in a moment, but that's just not how it works. When you actually stop to soberly observe what's actually happening in the music world, particularly in the genres that most frequently commission composers. So think of band directors, choral directors, film producers, other people who are producing media. They don't care how good your music is. Your music is there to serve a purpose for them. And what they care about far more is the relationship that you have with them. I was reading a book by Derek Sievers the other day. He's the founder of CD Baby, and he said this quote that really struck with me, and I think it's absolutely true. People send business to people they like. Even if we want to start talking about the orchestra world, where, it seems that, there's definitely a meritocracy here. It's definitely like you have to be good. But even here, it still breaks down. And, this might be slightly contentious, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Do it.
Orchestras care a lot more about the prestige of the people that they work with than their merit. Which isn't to say that, these people aren't good composers. They're absolutely good composers, and they're absolutely great soloists. So, that's definitely the case. But part of the ethos of an orchestra is that they're setting themselves as an institution. They're setting themselves up as this prestigious institution. This is the mythology that surrounds the orchestra. This is their branding, right? And so they want to bring in musicians and they want to bring in composers that support their brand of this is exclusive, this is of a high caliber. And so if you can play to that, that's a major part of what it is that they're after. I'll give you an example of this.
Okay.
So think, for instance, of who the BBC Proms commissions. Really, I think it's awesome how much music that the Proms commission. But, recent commissions from the Proms have included composers like Hans Zimmer and Eric Whitacre. Both of these guys are great composers, but, many people would say that these aren't the technically strongest or most imaginative. I don't have a bone to pick there because I do think that both Eric and Hans are really great composers, but because they have these powerful stories and that they've strongly integrated their technique to serve these stories. You look at what Hans does in his film scores, it fits the movie like a glove. Regardless of how well it works as concert music outside of the movie, but with the movie, it's fabulous. And likewise, you look at what Eric Whitacre has done in the choral scene, like the experience of singing Eric Whitacre's music. I say this as a choral singer. Back before the pandemic, I was singing in a church choir here in Cambridge, and we sung his Lux Amaraque. The experience of singing Eric's music is different than a lot of the experience of singing other music that we were singing in the choir. And so both Eric and Hans create these experiences that are unique and that are powerful and that, have made a substantial impact in the film and the choral worlds. And it's that substantial impact in the film and choral worlds that, lends them this prestige that makes them attractive to orchestras, that says, oh, Hans Zimmer and Eric Whitacre are prestigious composers. Therefore, if we commission them, that will be on brand.
Right.
This episode is sponsored by Dorico, the future of scoring. And we want to feature real Dorico users so you can know that real composers out in the world today are using Dorico to make their careers happen.
My name is Homayoun Kazemi. I'm a composer. I'm studying my master's degree in the Utrecht Conservatory in Holland. I study spectralism and I combine Iranian music, melodies, and a lot of stuff from my culture. There are these quarter tones that you can use. The fact that Dorico can play these quarter tones. The magic for me is parts. I hate making parts, but Dorico is like, hey, I will do it for you. Usually, like 90% of the time, it's what you want. And then you just do a little bit modification and then that's it. And that saves a lot of time. Even the print, like I showed one of my teachers a print, and then he was like, wow, this is different. I mean, even the print looks different, the fonts and I maybe the DPI or something, I don't know, but it looks really good on paper as well. For contemporary composers and people who want to do graphic notation, Dorico is now going into it. It's the beginning, but even now it's really good. Yes, I would definitely recommend Dorico. One of the main reasons and the first reason to get Dorico is the price, which is really good. And also you get a lot of features, you get the sample library, you get the ease of making parts because it saves a huge amount of time. When you're composing or when you're working, you don't really have to think about finding things. If they're just there, you just have to have a general knowledge about the shortcuts and the whole tab system, and then it will go great.
The kind folks at Dorico have set up a special web page so you can go and download a free 30-day trial copy of Dorico. So go and do that. I have been using the program and I'm absolutely in love with it. Go to www.steinberg.net/TPC.
There's a few things that are coming to mind for me as I'm hearing you say that, and I'm in agreement with you. The first is that Derek Sivers quote is fantastic. I think the full thing is people do business with those they like, know, and trust, which is a business maxim. And it's so true. So who knows you, really? And do they like you? And then do they trust you? And if you meet all three, then you're probably going to get opportunities. And then secondly, just this week, yesterday, as a matter of fact, there was a Twitter post by a composer who asked this question to the Twitterverse about applying for grants. And the idea was this kind of despairing moment of, I never win these things. At what point do we stop? And there were some really good replies in the thread. But overwhelmingly, one of the themes that came up is, the grants and opportunities that most composers are applying for are really inner circle games for those prestigious institutions. The ones who win are the ones who went to the big powerhouse schools or they had a big powerhouse composer as a teacher. And it fits in exactly with what you're saying right here.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on, some of those specific grants and awards without knowing them specifically, but that general idea does line up, yes.
Yeah.
It reminds me of as well is one of the things that Seth Godin often says is, people like us do things like this.
Mm-hmm.
As these institutions want to amass around themselves more people like them.
Yeah, because there's safety in what you know, and they've created a culture that says, this is how we act and this is what we do. This is how we're pushing the envelope. And only those who push the envelope in the same way are the ones who are part of the circle.
Yeah.
It's terribly sad.
Well, and look, and on the one hand, that can be frustrating. On the other hand, man, that works 100% in your favor because you are looking for the people like us do things like this. You are looking, again, like Seth Godin says, to find your tribe, and they are out there. This is related to this idea that there doesn't need to be a scarcity mindset.
100%. So let's take into one of the other areas. So we've talked about relationships quite a bit, and you've got stories, process, and technique. Which one of those three remaining ones do you see is a big struggle for composers as they're trying to put their voice together?
I think process, Garrett.
In what way?
You see it in a couple of different ways. A question that I often hear from composers is why does it feel like pulling teeth to write music? Or, why is it that I'm just not excited to sit down and compose today? For instance, there are a lot of composers that when they started writing music, they learned a handful of process systems that enabled them to write their music. Essentially, you could summarize it as I need to block out a big chunk of time. I'm maybe going to improvise a little or tinker with ideas. Sometimes I might map out the piece beforehand, and then I'm just going to write from left to right. And if I get stuck, I need to just wait for sudden strokes of inspiration. For a lot of composers, this is an oversimplification of their process, but it's not that much of an oversimplification of their process. And if these are the only process strategies that you have for writing music, then yeah, you're going to get stuck very often and very fast.
What are some of the process strategies that you like to throw into your composition bag? Because I imagine, based on the day, you change it up. So what are some other process strategies that composers could incorporate that you do?
Yeah, the main composition strategy that I use that is really adaptable, and it's this. 2 parts. Shrink the box, trust the process. The first one, shrink the box, is, what you're actually doing with your process. And then the second one, trust the process, I'd call a framing story. And we can get into what a framing story is later. What shrink the box means is that it's related to this different, I think it was the poet Auden who said that constrictions make you more free. I know that Stravinsky said similar kinds of things about constraints, is that when you're working on something, the first thing that you need to do is you need to stop thinking about your music holistically, which can be a bit of a challenge because that's how your right brain works. Your right brain tends to see things as one big, happy or jumbled clump. And instead, you need to think about your music parametrically. You can break it down into, okay, what's happening in pitch, what's happening in rhythm, what's happening in orchestration, and you can break it down even further than that. What you do is you narrow the parameters in play. As you say, okay, this passage that I'm working on, something about it isn't working. So instead of just trying to listen to it over and over again or play it over and over again and just like, man, what am I going to do with this passage? And get increasingly frustrated, you can systematically go through the different parameters until you get it right. So for instance, if I'm working on a passage that I'm finding frustrating, well, actually, let me give you a specific example. So I'm working on this passage in my band piece, and this is something that I'll probably get to working on later today. And there's this melody that I'm trying to get it to work. And the harmony under it is, pretty good. But what I need to do next is I need to get the voice leading right within the melody. And by voice leading, I mean sort of like a Schenkerian kind of, local high points and what are the passing tones, that kind of thing, right? I mean, it's a band piece. Instead of worrying about all of the instruments that are playing in this passage, instead of worrying about all the harmony, that sort of stuff, it's like, okay, let's first get this specific aspect of this melody right. If I want to make sure that the structural landmarks of this melody are in place, it's like, okay, good. These structural landmarks are in place. Am I ornamenting this melody the way that I want it to? Yeah, okay, good. So that's good. And so then I can back up and I can be like, okay, do I have this harmonized the way that I want it to be harmonized in order to fit into the formal goals that I have for this passage? And it's like, yeah, okay, I've got that. And then I can look at, okay, what's happening with this texture? Is the way that I've arranged this melody within the ensemble, is it sitting flat? Is it doing what I want? So kind of like what I'm suggesting is I go parametrically one by one of making sure that things are working. And the same way that I go from parameter to parameter, when I'm working on a specific thing, like say, go back to that melody, right? Is I'm very conscious of like, okay, this is the change that I'm making to this melody right now. Does this particular change work? Yes or no? And then it's like, okay, what's the next change that I want to make? Does that work? Yes or no? And so what you end up doing for yourself is you end up creating thousands of these really easy, small choices. And that is so liberating, just because it's like instead of having to make a whole bunch of complicated things all at once, you just make a bunch of really easy. I mean, oftentimes these are yes, no things.
So in summary, you look at each of the individual elements of music, and you mentioned melody, harmony in the context of voice leading, but you could also add timbre, which was the orchestration stuff, and then there's rhythm and meter, which you didn't talk about, but I imagine that's part of the process.
Yeah.
And then that simplifies the whole system because you're not focused on a huge piece, you're just focused on one small bite. Is that the idea?
That is exactly the idea. You just focus on little bits at a time. And then, so that's what you're doing in your composing, but this whole idea of shrinking the box also applies to the larger process as well. Instead of saying, well, I'm just going to sit down and work for as much time as I have, you say, no, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to work for 45 minutes. Gives you a very clear start and end point. Likewise, you sit down and you say, this is my output goal. My goal is to finish 4 measures, or my goal is to finish 30 seconds, or, whatever it is that you set for yourself, such that instead of it just being this ill-defined, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to work, and I'm going to see what happens, you actually know when you've met your objectives, whether that's parametrically or, within the framework that you've given yourself of these are my goals and this is the hours or time that I'm going to be working.
Yeah, I love it. That's a great framework in which to wrap it up. So this whole thing walks through 4 different key ideas, and we've discussed 2. We've discussed process and relationships. I don't want to give away the whole kit and caboodle, but where can people go to find out more, or if they have questions, they want to reach out to you? What's available? Where can they go?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that are available to them. If you go to my website, I have a specific page for this, josephsowa.com. So, just my name, josephsowa.com/coaching. And if you go to that page, what you'll do is you'll find several different resources. You'll find these 4 different voices, the explanation of how those work within your artistic chorale. You'll find an explanation for that. You'll also find a self-assessment that you can take to see how well these different voices are working within your own personal artistic chorale.
And is the idea to ideally have a fairly integrated compositional process between the 4 voices? What would the analysis do for me if I took it?
So what the analysis would do is it would show you which of those 4 voices is out of harmony with the others. And then it would give you some directions of, okay, say your process is out of whack. These are some next steps that you could take to shore that up.
That's great. So josephsowa.com/coaching. Joseph, this is really a fascinating framework, and I can see how composers who are struggling with the creative voice as well as their process could really benefit from working through this.
Yeah, I really think so too. Like I said, this is something that I've been working on myself for more than the past decade. I mean, it was probably the main reason why I went through and I got my doctorate. And then, the funny thing happened is that I get my doctorate, which is around the time that these pieces really start to falling together. And I'm just like, oh, well, I've been stuck looking at the trees and now I see the forest. And I'm like, well, I want to use my voice now. So
yeah. I'm curious, as this enlightenment was happening for you and you're graduating with your doctorate and you're looking at the current job market and then COVID hits, in what ways does this embolden you and how will it embolden other composers to not be stuck in the I have to get a teaching job mindset?
Yeah, that's a great question. It emboldens me because I feel empowered. And I know that all of your listeners this is what I want for your listeners too. And I fully believe that they can get it. I feel empowered to speak and act with authenticity. I feel empowered to work with greater energy and focus, to create with confidence and flexibility, and to nurture the community that I'm in and ultimately make a lasting impact. I fully see that, as something in myself and something that your listeners can do as well.
Okay, Joseph, this has been a good conversation. I want to ask you one more question. And it's one you've heard me ask on the podcast lots of times. What is one actionable step that someone listening to this could take today to begin integrating their compositional voice?
Yeah, I would encourage anyone listening to this podcast to go and take that self-assessment It has a bunch of questions that are in there that the people who have taken this so far have assured me it's going to bring to mind all of the things that you've been ignoring and you know that you need to do, but just remind you that, yeah, you probably should do that thing. And it will be encouraging for you in a way that says, yeah, this is some validation that, yeah, this is important, but you can do it. You can make it happen. Another thing that I'd like to talk with you a little bit about, Garrett, if we have some time.
Sure.
I'd also like to talk about a little bit more about like why it was that I was struggling for so long and how it is your listeners don't have to struggle as much.
Yeah, tell me about that.
When I was going through my process of, I don't know if I'm good enough, I don't know if I have enough technique, I'm not entirely sure how to get my music performed. When I was going through that process, you can think of how I approached it, kind of a ladder of resources. These different rungs of the ladder give you different amounts of input. So at the bottommost rung of the ladder, you have social media posts and blogs. And then just above that, you have books. And these are like passive ways of engaging with ideas and finding out, okay, what's the next thing that I can do with my career? The upside of them is that they're generally free and they're generally cheap and they create context when you're actually actively engaging with another person. But the real big downside, and I am a total nerd and it took me a long time to see this downside because I love books and I love reading, is that it's difficult to know what of your reading applies to you or how it applies to you. And then often you're just not aware of what the right resources are to begin with. And so for me, all of these things, it took me years and years to accomplish some of the things that I've accomplished. And really, these are things that I could have done in weeks or months had I had someone that was right there with me, working with me. You go up to the next step of the ladder and you have your professional connections, whether that's mentors or teachers or, people that are already part of your network. The upside of, working with these people is that you get personal advice, but the downside of this is that that advice comes in short bursts. When you're working with someone in a mentor relationship, this is, they're offering you their advice for free. And, as wonderful as that is, that's not something that you want to take advantage of if you actually want to maintain a good relationship with that person. And then that leads me to the highermost rung of the ladder, which is coaching, which is what I do. And although this does require monetary investment, the upside is it gives you sustained personal attention that allows you to, navigate what are the resources that I need right now and how can I have the accountability to accomplish what it is that I'm trying to accomplish and have someone just take you and walk with you that entire step of the way. And so, people at different points of their career, different resources are useful. Sometimes books and blogs, that's enough. Other times, working with professional connections and getting their advice is useful. But if you're the kind of person that wants to make a big impact and has been working on their own and just sees that what they're doing hasn't been working, then I'd suggest that you look into coaching as a possibility of how you could take the next step in leveling up.
I couldn't agree more. Coaching is extremely powerful, and the best definition that I have for coaching is that the coach deepens the learning and furthers the action. And to piggyback on what you said, and I'm just augmenting, I agree with everything you outlined, is that we often feel like we're taking action by being busy reading books and blogs or listening to podcasts such as this one. That is information acquisition. It's not actually taking action, but we can fill our time with it. And so we feel like we're busy moving forward, but sometimes we're not. And the coach can actually help you take that action by applying what you're learning. So yeah, Joseph, this is great. I'm glad that you're putting yourself out there as a coach. I think you're going to help a lot of people integrate their voice and really grow in their career. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Garrett.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I think that that's everything. In terms of where people can reach me, again, my website is josephsowa.com. Feel free to email me as well, joseph@josephsowa.com. Any questions or if you want to chat, just hit me up.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You're welcome, Garrett. Thanks.
This episode of The Portfolio Composer has been supported by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Whether you're a composer or arranger, a teacher or student, working in music engraving and publishing, or working in producing music for media such as film, TV, and games, Dorico is the tool for you. Dorico comes in two versions: Dorico Pro for professionals and Dorico Elements, providing the perfect introduction to the world of scoring. Whichever version you choose, you'll be using software packed full of smart features that produces beautiful results completely automatically, allowing you to get music on the stand more quickly than with any other software. You can bring music into Dorico from your existing software using Music XML or MIDI, and you can try Dorico out completely free of charge for 30 days by downloading a trial version from dorico.com/TPC. Try it today.